Hello, and thanks for stopping by. When it comes to phobias, let's be honest, being buried alive is by far one of the most disturbing, and with pretty good reason. I for one wouldn't want to experience it, that's for sure. This terrifying notion was especially common during the 19th century, when techniques for confirming death were not as advanced as they are today. This led some undertakers to offer safety coffins to those who could afford them, these being caskets kitted out with devices such as air pipes and alarm bells for alerting those above, should you suffer the misfortune of awaking to the nightmare of finding yourself lying 6 feet under. Despite the obvious dread associated with it, the concept of being buried alive became something of a craze in the 20th century, as a handful of brave, or crazy depending on how you look at it, men and women opted to be voluntarily entombed with a view to seeing who could endure a stint in the grave the longest. One such record-breaking attempt took place in the unlikely setting of Kilburn, North London, in 1968. This curious tale centres around the Admiral Nelson, a large pub which once stood at 93 Carlton Vale. Sadly, the Admiral Nelson has long since been demolished. The only hint it was ever here is this little close, which is named in the pub's honour. Most of Carlton Vale, in fact, looks very different to the way it did in the 1960s. A rare survivor though is the Carlton Tavern, which I covered in the second episode of my Exploring London's Pub series. I'll leave a link in the description in case you haven't seen it. The Admiral Nelson was a short walk away from the Carlton Tavern, and was located on the corner of Percy Road, known today as Pensland Road. In the 1960s, the Admiral Nelson was owned by a gentleman named Michael Sugrue, who is more commonly known by his nickname, Butty, a title which referred to his squat, robust build. Butty Sugrue was born into a farming family in County Limerick in 1924. He later moved to Kerry, and after a stint in the army in the 1940s, he joined Duffy's Circus, where he was billed as Ireland's strongest man. This was a valid claim, as Butty was a seasoned weightlifter who once demonstrated his prowess by dragging a double-decker bus along Dublin's O'Connell Street using only his teeth. Further proof of Butty's vigour, which he put down to eating raw meat, can be seen in this newsreel clip from 1954, in which he's shown lifting a boxer, Freddie Mills, in a chair, again using only his teeth. Butty also dabbled with wrestling before going on to become a boxing promoter, a role which would later see him bring the likes of Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, and Henry Cooper, seen here being hoisted up in a chair like Freddie Mills, to Ireland. In the late 1950s, Butty moved to Kilburn, which was a predominantly Irish area in those days, and he set about adding a number of London pubs to his business portfolio. These included the Elephant's Head in Camden, the Wellington Arms, which stood on the Oxbridge Road stretch of Shepherd's Bush Green, the site's now occupied by an arcade and a branch of KFC, plus of course the aforementioned Admiral Nelson. With his experience of circus performing, wrestling and boxing, Butty was a dab hand at publicity. Here he is pictured alongside Sophia Loren and Marlon Brando, and he was never too far away from a stunt. Such exploits included performing a strongman show at Maidstone Prison, holding back revving scooters and motorbikes with, as you can probably guess by now, his jaws, and more bizarrely, claiming he owned the stone head of Lord Nelson, which he'd supposedly obtained after Nelson's pillar was blown up in Dublin in 1966. If Butty did own this prized artefact, it's no longer in his family. It's now on display in the Dublin City Library. In the summer of 1967, Butty planned another PR stunt, the idea being that he would spend 200 hours all alone in a pitch-dark cellar. This feat of isolation was to be carried out below the King's Head on Acton High Street, which was owned by his friend Paul Kelly, but when the brewery heard about the pair's plans, they forbade it to go ahead. In the following year, however, Butty would mastermind a similar, albeit more extreme, scheme. One of the barmen who worked at the Admiral Nelson on Carlton Vale was 33-year-old Mike Meaney. Like Butty, Mike was an athletic fellow who hailed from Ireland. He'd been born in Tipperary and later moved to Mitchelstown in Cork before heading over to London. Mike had yearned to be a professional boxer, but sadly an injury put an end to his dream. He'd also worked as a labourer, during which time he'd been involved in a workplace accident that resulted in him being trapped beneath rubble for several hours, an ordeal he managed to survive thanks to extraordinary strength of mind. Although boxing was now out of the question, Mike hadn't given up on achieving fame, and with the experience he'd endured, he figured he'd be well suited to having a go at being buried alive in a coffin, his initial estimates being for a period of 50 days. By the 1960s, being buried alive had become quite a gimmick, and it was the eccentric sort of stunt that was right up Butty Sugrue Street. Butty stepped in therefore to become Mike's agent, and the game was on. First was the coffin. Mike was 5 foot 8 inches tall, and the casket in which he would languish was custom made. It measured 7 foot long by 2 foot 6 inches wide and was just 18 inches tall. Inside, this claustrophobic sarcophagus was lined with foam padding. An electric light bulb was also provided, and a rudimentary lavatory was improvised too. This consisted of a hatch which emptied into a pit of lime. I can certainly think of more comfortable places to go. In the coffin's lid, 2 6-inch wide holes were cut, into which 2 large tubes would be inserted. As well as providing oxygen, these pipes would also be used to pass food and other items down to Mike. To prepare for his ordeal, Mike slept in the coffin above ground, and carried out physical training, often upstairs in the Admiral Nelson, where the public were invited to come and watch. He also worked on developing important deep breathing techniques. Next was where to bury the coffin. As you can imagine, even in 1960s London, there are few places suitable for accommodating such an odd request. Fortunately though, a local businessman named Mike Meaney owned a lorry depot in Kilburn, and he agreed to allow a corner of his yard to be used as Mike's temporary resting place. This site was located on Malvern Mews, approximately a quarter of a mile away from the Admiral Nelson. Mike Meaney's crack at being buried alive commenced on Wednesday the 21st of February 1968. That afternoon, upstairs in the Admiral Nelson's function room, he tucked into what was dubbed his last supper before a large group of journalists and well-wishers. The coffin, whose lid was carved with the words, "Here lies Mike Meaney," was also present for all to examine. After the meal, Mike was physically lifted into his tomb by Butty. He then donned a pair of blue pyjamas and was sealed in. Due to its size, the coffin had to be passed out through the Admiral Nelson's upper window, which must have been a pretty hairy ordeal in itself, and from here it was loaded onto the back of one of Mike Meaney's lorries. The coffin was then driven a short distance to Malvern Mews. Once at Malvern Mews, the coffin was lowered into an ominous grave, which Mike Meaney himself had dug earlier. Reports of the grave's depth varied. Some said it was 7 or 8 foot, whilst others put it at 11 foot. After the soil was shoveled and packed in, a temporary shelter was erected around the site, and people were soon queuing up to view Mike's grave and shout messages of support down to him. This appears to be the approximate spot on Malvern Mews, beneath which Mike was buried. Despite the hoo-ha surrounding Mike's premature burial, one important person who wasn't initially aware of his madcap stunt was his wife, Alice, who was still living back in Ireland. Mike had, shall we say, neglected to tell her his plans, most likely because she'd have discouraged such a balmy idea, and the first Alice heard was via a news report on the radio. Apparently though she took the revelation rather well, and was content to just let Mike get on with it. Deep down below, Mike soon settled into a routine. 7 AM was his usual wake-up time, followed by exercise which was limited to a series of partial press-ups. Following that, he'd rub oil into his muscles, take breakfast such as scrambled egg and grapefruit, and then lie back to read boxing books and magazines, along with the latest newspapers. Dinner often consisted of chicken and vegetables, and most importantly, tea was provided with a flask passed back and forth along the tube. Up above, as Mike would have no doubt read in the papers, the world continued on. A turbulent demonstration against the Vietnam War broke out in Grosvenor Square. The old London Bridge was sold to the American oil tycoon Robert P. McCulloch. And the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. In music, meanwhile, Delilah by Tom Jones, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, which sadly was a posthumous release following Otis Redding's then recent tragic death, and Lady Madonna by the Beatles were amongst the many classic hits that appeared in the charts, whilst Mike lay underground. At one point in his stretch, a camera was lowered down the pipe, allowing Mike to snap several photos of himself. I doubt there are many people who can claim to have taken a selfie in such an environment. Mike also celebrated St Patrick's Day 1968 in his coffin, with Guinness and whiskey passed down, whilst live music was performed above. As the days passed, Mike said the worst things he had to endure were the stifling heat and lack of normal conversation. He also had a major scare when one of Keane's 10-ton lorries accidentally reversed towards the burial site. Despite such problems, Mike vowed to push on, his determination driven by the fact that, at the very same time over in America, another fellow, a country singer by the name of Bill White, was also having a go at breaking the record for being buried alive. Things came to a head early on in the attempt, when, on the 3rd of March, a transatlantic telephone call was arranged between the two men, both of whom by this point were deep underground. After a few brief pleasantries, the talk quickly turned sour, as insults were flung in a manner similar to a tense boxing weigh-in. Bill, who was buried in Austin, Texas, claimed his coffin was cold and wet, unlike Mike's, which, being foam padded, he likened to a powder puff box. Mike's angry response was that Bill's box was far bigger. He'd earlier joked it was big enough to raise a family in, and continued to emphasise his points whilst repeatedly referring to the American contender as a bum, and that no mercy would be shown. In the end, Mike beat Bill White. The American lasted 55 days, whilst Mike was finally raised on April the 22nd after 61 days below ground. It took 2 teams of 3 men half an hour to dig Mike up, and as they worked, a huge crowd looked on as the London Irish Girl Pipers provided music and dancing. Once the coffin had been exhumed, it was placed onto a lorry and paraded through the streets of Kilburn, all of which were lined with thousands of spectators, and during the drive, Mike greeted the crowds by waving enthusiastically through one of the coffin's holes. On a personal note, my dad, who was a youngster living in the area at the time, happened to be there that day and witnessed the spectacle, from the upper floor of this very building in fact, and he remembers people chanting, "Michael Meaney's mad." After the victory parade, the coffin returned to where it had all begun, the Admiral Nelson, where it was hoisted back up into the function room and finally prized open. Now sporting a large bushy beard and sunglasses to protect his eyes, Mike was examined by a doctor, who gave him the all clear, expressing surprise at just how healthy the plucky Irishman was in the wake of his ordeal. Mike was then presented with a cup by the boxer Alan Budkin, and Diana Dawes was also on hand to welcome him back. Unfortunately, although Mike had lasted 61 days in his coffin, no representative from the Guinness Book of Records was present at the ceremony, meaning, despite the media surrounding it, his achievement was never officially logged. Nevertheless, there were plans for Mike to embark upon a European tour, as well as a potential side-by-side challenge with his old American foe, Bill White. Had this gone ahead, it was planned to have the pair buried beneath concrete, with a £5,000 prize up for grabs, about £89,000 in today's money. Sadly, neither of these plans came to fruition, and just a few months later, Mike was quoted as saying that he'd probably made about £100 from his escapade, all of which he sent back to his wife Alice in Ireland. "This business has just about ruined my life," he said. "I was probably better off in the coffin." Like Mike, Butty Sugrue claimed he'd made little from the burial. He died at the Wellington Arms pub in Shepherd's Bush in October 1977, whilst, ever the strongman, attempting to lug a fridge up a flight of stairs. He was just 53 years old. Mike Meaney, meanwhile, passed away on the 17th of February 2003. There were plenty of smiles at Mike's funeral when the priest remarked, "I've never buried someone who has been buried before." Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed hearing about Mike Meaney's remarkable story. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the residents of Malvern Mews, who not only allowed me to film there, but also provided invaluable information as to Mike's approximate burial place. I'd also love to hear your own thoughts on the story. Were you aware that a man was once buried alive in Kilburn? Or perhaps you, or a relative, remembers it happening? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. As ever, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to all of you who support this channel with kind words and likes. They mean so much to me. I'd also like to express a special welcome to all new subscribers. It's great to have you here. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this will ensure you don't miss out on any future content, whilst also helping the channel to grow. And if you do sign up, please be sure to click the bell icon, as this will let you know whenever I post a new video. You may be interested to know that I have 2 books currently available. The Knowledge, Train Your Brain Like a Cabbie, published by Quercus, which combines history and trivia with special memory techniques, and Waterloo Station, A History of London's Busiest Terminus, published by Crowwood, which does exactly what it says on the tin. I also have an Etsy store, Rob's Online Designs, where you'll find a selection of mugs featuring hand-drawn designs of buses, taxis, tube trains and so on. Links are all in the description. For now, thanks again friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.